Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're tackling something absolutely central to how science progresses: scientific creativity. We've got a fascinating collection of research that really digs into what makes scientific work and the scientists themselves creative. Think of this as your shortcut to the key understandings in this field, what generates those, light bulb moments that change how we see the world.
Exactly. We're going to explore scientific creativity from various angles. Our sources look at how we judge a creative scientific output, the personality traits of the individuals behind it, the thinking processes involved, and even the environments that encourage it. Our main goal is really to extract the most crucial insights for you.
Precisely. We'll be navigating four main areas.
Mhm.
First, the creative product itself. What makes it stand out and how do we assess that?
Right.
Second, the creative person. What are the hallmarks of a creative scientist? Third, the creative process. What are the typical stages and mechanisms leading to breakthroughs? And finally, the creative situation, the broader context that either helps or hinders creativity.
And we'll also touch on a really interesting overarching theory, Simonton's chance configuration theory, and peek at where future research might be heading.
Okay, let's dive right in then with what comes at the other end: the creative product.
So when we talk about a creative scientific product, whether it's like a groundbreaking paper, a new experimental method, or a game-changing theory, the definitions generally agree on two core elements. It needs to be original, something new, unusual, unexpected,
Great.
but just being different isn't enough. It also needs to be valuable, useful, good, adaptive, appropriate within the scientific context.
Which immediately raises a tricky question, doesn't it? What one person hails as revolutionary, another might see as just, well, a small step forward. Our sources acknowledge this inherent subjectivity in judging creativity.
Oh, absolutely.
So how do we try to get a more objective handle on just how creative a scientific product truly is?
Well, two main approaches have become pretty prominent. The first is citation counts. We're talking about major databases like the Science Citation Index, SCI, and the Social Sciences Citation Index, SSCI. Yeah.
Think of these as massive trackers that record how often a particular publication is referenced by other scientists in their work.
Right. So the idea is that if a piece of work is really significant and valuable, it's going to be cited more often by other researchers who are building upon that knowledge. And these databases allow us to see those patterns on a large scale, even to evaluate someone's overall impact over time.
Precisely. However, while it seems straightforward, there are limitations when we look at individual publications.
Yeah.
For instance, a very specialized paper might only be relevant to a small group of experts.
True.
So even if it's a brilliant contribution within that niche, its citation count might stay relatively low simply because of the size of that particular research community.
Uh-huh.
The prestige of the journal it's published in also matters. Papers in well-known journals tend to get more attention and therefore more citations.
Right. Even the language of the publication plays a role, with English language papers generally reaching a wider audience. And it's interesting that in fields like psychology, papers that introduce new methods or techniques often receive more citations than purely theoretical or experimental studies.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
If you develop a new way of analyzing data, a lot of people across different areas of psychology might end up using it and citing your work.
Exactly.
So while citation counts give us a quantitative measure, it's clearly not the complete picture. What's the other main way our sources say we try to evaluate scientific creativity?
That would be expert ratings. This approach tries to make the evaluation process more structured and based on agreed-upon criteria. One particularly comprehensive model mentioned is the Creative Product Analysis Matrix by Bazimer and Treffinger.
Okay.
This model breaks down the evaluation into 14 specific criteria across three main areas: novelty, resolution, and elaboration and synthesis.
Okay, let's delve into those areas. Novelty that clearly relates to the originality aspect we discussed earlier. What are some of the specific things they look for under novelty?
Exactly. Novelty examines how much the product introduces new methods, materials, techniques, or concepts. Specific criteria here include being original, meaning genuinely new, germinal, suggesting it could spark new lines of research, and even transformational, indicating a fundamental shift in thinking within the field.
Interesting. And resolution. That sounds like it addresses the valuable part of the definition, how well the product actually does what it's supposed to do.
Yes, resolution focuses on how effectively the product solves the problem it was intended to address. Does it meet the demands of the scientific question? Is it effective and appropriate for its purpose?
And the last area, elaboration and synthesis.
This looks at how well the product integrates different, perhaps seemingly unconnected elements into a well-developed and coherent whole. It's about bringing things together in a meaningful and insightful way. Based on this matrix, Bessemer and others developed the Creative Product Semantic Scale, or CPSS, which is essentially a rating tool.
Right.
However, while it has been used to evaluate creativity in artistic and commercial products, our sources note that it hasn't been widely adopted in the scientific community. There were also other rating instruments developed specifically for science, but, well, they haven't really gained traction either. So while we aim for more objective measures, citation counts, despite their limitations, remain a very common tool.
All right, so we've looked at how we evaluate the creative product. Now let's shift our focus to the person behind that product, the creative scientist. How do we even begin to define what makes a scientist creative?
Well, mirroring the definition of a creative work, a creative scientist is often defined as someone recognized by experts in their field as having made a contribution of original value to our understanding. Again, this definition carries some, inherent subjectivity.
Yeah.
And when we think of creative scientists, our minds often jump to the iconic figures like Einstein.
Right, it's easy to point to the real giants of scientific history.
Yeah.
But how do we identify creative scientists more broadly, beyond just naming these legendary figures, especially since standard creativity tests, according to our sources, haven't shown a strong link to actual creative achievements in science?
Exactly. So researchers have explored a range of indicators. These include assessments from peers and supervisors, the significance of prizes and awards a scientist has received, their membership in prestigious scientific societies, and sometimes even combining these different indicators into comprehensive sets.
Okay.
However, the most frequently used and important approaches bring us back to what we discussed with the creative product, looking at the number of publications and how often those publications are cited, but now focusing on the individual scientist's overall body of work.
So does quantity actually matter? I think there's a popular image of the genius who only produces a few truly groundbreaking works. But our sources seem to challenge that idea.
They do. Consider Poincaré, for example, who published around 500 papers and 30 books.
Well,
Empirical research has actually demonstrated a significant correlation between the number of a scientist's publications and their scientific eminence as judged by other measures. Simonton is even quoted as saying, "The distinguishing characteristic of genius, scientific or otherwise, is immense productivity." Of course, there are exceptions like Mendel, who published only 7 papers. But the general trend suggests that highly productive individuals are more likely to be recognized as eminent.
That's a really interesting point that goes against the common perception. But simply counting all publications equally has its own drawbacks, right? A brief communication to a journal shouldn't necessarily have the same weight as a major research article.
Absolutely. This is where weighted publication indices come into play. Endler, for instance, developed indices that assign different values to different types of publications.
Okay.
So a book might be assigned a weight of 20, a journal article a weight of 4, and an unpublished report just 1. This is an attempt to account for the varying levels of effort and potential impact associated with different forms of scientific output.
And citation counts, when we look at the person, tell us about their overall influence and impact within the scientific community.
Precisely. A scientist whose work is consistently cited by others is generally seen as having made significant contributions that have shaped subsequent research. These citation counts have also been shown to correlate with other indicators of eminence, like receiving prestigious awards or holding leadership positions in scientific organizations. However, just as when evaluating a single product, there are limitations. Citations to books aren't always included in these counts. The quality of the cited work isn't assessed. I mean, a paper could be cited for its flaws.
Good point.
There's a bias against publications in languages other than English, and it largely overlooks contributions beyond publications, such as patents, teaching, reviewing, or administrative roles.
So these productivity measures, while providing valuable data, definitely give us an incomplete picture. Our sources also touch on some broader trends related to who becomes most visible and impactful in science, highlighting elitism, sexism, and ageism within these metrics. Let's unpack those.
Right. Elitism, in this context, refers to the observation that a relatively small percentage of scientists produce a large proportion of the published work and receive the majority of citations. Dennis's earlier research suggested that perhaps 10% of authors might be responsible for around 50% of the scientific literature.
Wow, 10% doing half the work.
Yeah, And more recent data also indicates that within highly ranked psychology departments, for example, a significant number of faculty have very few citations, while a much smaller group receives the vast majority of attention. It's important to note that publication and citation counts tend to be quite strongly correlated,
Okay.
suggesting that those who publish more frequently also tend to be cited more often.
And sexism refers to the documented trend that women, on average, tend to publish less and have less prominence in science when these metrics are used.
Yes, Cole's work from back in 1981 brought this to the forefront. While the reasons are definitely multifaceted, one potential explanation mentioned in our sources relates to societal expectations and social responsibilities that may disproportionately affect the time and energy women are able to dedicate to their professional careers.
Right, that makes sense. And finally, ageism. How does a scientist's productivity typically change with age?
Lehman's research, which was later re-examined by Simonton, suggests that scientific productivity often follows what's called an inverted backward J curve.
On what now?
An inverted backward J curve. Basically, it typically starts in the 20s, rises quite rapidly to a peak in the late 30s or early 40s, and then gradually declines.
Okay.
However, the specific age at which this peak occurs can vary across different scientific disciplines. Interestingly, there's a negative correlation between the age at which a scientist makes their first significant contribution and their total lifetime output.
Huh. So starting earlier often means producing more overall.
It seems so. And it's not unusual for highly eminent scientists to have very long publishing careers, sometimes spanning 50 years or more.
50 years.
Yeah, and while the sheer number of publications might decrease in later career stages, it's also argued by some gerontologists that senior scholars contribute in valuable ways that go beyond just the number of publications, drawing on their extensive experience and accumulated wisdom.
That's a really important point to keep in mind. Now, shifting away from productivity, what about intelligence?
Yeah.
Is a super high IQ a necessary ingredient for being a creative scientist?
That's a common assumption, but the relationship is more complex than a simple one-to-one link. Standard IQ tests, which often involve quite general problem-solving tasks, aren't really designed to differentiate among individuals who are already highly successful scientists. However, it's certainly not to say that successful scientists would perform poorly on these tests. In fact, the consistent finding is that creative scientists do tend to have substantially above average intelligence. A certain level of intellectual ability is likely necessary just to get through the demanding process of advanced graduate studies and to master a complex scientific field.
But once you've reached that level, once you're in the game.
This is where the threshold effect comes into play.
Yeah.
The idea is that above a certain IQ level that's needed to become proficient in a particular field, a higher IQ doesn't necessarily differentiate between the more and less creative professionals within that same field.
Interesting.
The actual IQ threshold might also vary across different disciplines, potentially being higher in the sciences compared to the arts, for instance. So while a certain level of intelligence is probably a prerequisite, it's not the primary factor determining who will be highly creative in science beyond that initial threshold. Unfortunately, specialized tests designed specifically to predict success in science, well, they have not been particularly successful in doing so thus far.
So intelligence might get you in the ballpark, but what drives you to really push the boundaries of knowledge? That leads us to personality and motivation. What consistent patterns have researchers observed in the characteristics of creative scientists?
Research has revealed fairly consistent patterns in the personality traits and motivations of creative scientists. However, it's also important to remember that there's significant individual variation,
Right.
which has led to distinctions like Curtin's adapter versus innovator types and Simonton's idea of a career-long shift from more intuitive to more analytical approaches to genius. Endler's observations also suggest a trend as scientists mature, moving from more empirical, data-driven work towards more integrative and theoretical contributions.
And these different characteristics might be more important at different stages of the creative process itself, right?
Exactly. Mansfield and Buss's model is particularly insightful here. They propose 5 stages in the creative act. First, selecting the problem to work on. Second, putting in the extended effort required. Third, setting the initial constraints or boundaries for the problem. Fourth, being able to change those constraints when necessary. And fifth, the verification and elaboration of the solution.
Okay.
And they link specific personality and motivational variables to success in each of these stages.
That's a really useful way to think about it. Can you give us some examples of these links?
Certainly. For the initial stage of problem selection, Traits like autonomy, wanting to work independently, personal flexibility, a strong need for originality, and a desire for professional recognition seem to be particularly important.
Uh-huh.
The second stage, extended effort, that long period of dedicated work, is strongly linked to a general commitment to one's work. Pretty straightforward.
Makes sense.
When it comes to setting and then being able to change constraints, characteristics like autonomy again, personal flexibility, openness to new experiences, and even aesthetic sensitivity play a role.
Okay.
Finally, commitment to work and the need for professional recognition are essential for the verification and elaboration stage, where the findings are refined and prepared for sharing.
It's fascinating to see how different aspects of personality and motivation fuel different parts of the creative process.
Yeah.
The model also considers some of the developmental experiences that might shape these traits, if I recall correctly.
Yes. Mansfield and Buss also included factors from a scientist's upbringing, such as a less emotionally intense parent-child relationship, parents who encouraged independence, a home environment that stimulated intellectual curiosity, and the experience of mentorship or apprenticeship.
Right.
They suggest that these developmental factors can influence the personality and motivational traits that then indirectly affect the creative process.
Yeah.
However, they acknowledge that the links here are more speculative.
Got it.
Our sources also mention other personality characteristics that have been repeatedly associated with scientific creativity, such as a lower level of sociability, a degree of assertiveness or aggressiveness, a desire to be dominant, and a tendency towards introversion.
That paints a pretty distinct picture of a, maybe not typical, but a frequently observed creative scientist. Now, the final aspect of the creative person we need to discuss is a rather intriguing and sometimes debated one: the potential link between creativity and psychopathology. Is there any evidence to suggest that these might be related in scientists?
This is an area that has been discussed and researched for a long, long time. There's certainly anecdotal evidence and biographies that suggest a connection. For instance, Judah's 1949 study found a higher rate of manic depressive disorders in creative scientists compared to the general population.
Oh.
However, this contrasts with findings from personality questionnaires, which often describe successful scientists as being emotionally stable.
So we have conflicting findings there. How do we reconcile that?
Precisely. It's tricky. Oxe, in her review of the literature, concludes that there is some correlation between creativity and psychopathology, suggesting that it might arise from a strong internal drive, perhaps fueled by some underlying emotional insecurity,
Okay.
which can lead to either significant intellectual achievements or emotional difficulties. Some larger-scale studies looking at the general population and some self-report data have also found indications of this association, although the correlations aren't always very strong.
Right.
Ultimately, Oxe makes a key point. Psychopathology is not a necessary requirement for creativity, as many highly creative individuals are mentally healthy. And conversely, being mentally healthy doesn't mean someone can't be creative, as some creative individuals clearly do struggle with mental health issues.
That's a really important nuance to understand. It's not a simple cause and effect. So we've explored the creative product and the creative person. Now, let's delve into the creative process itself. Are there identifiable stages that scientists typically go through when making a significant discovery?
Indeed, there are many different models that describe the creative process as a series of stages. Many of these models, often based on creators' own accounts in various fields, including science, outline the creative act as a sequence of distinct phases.
Yeah.
These phases have been interpreted through different psychological frameworks, such as Gestalt psychology, which emphasizes how we see things as complete wholes, and psychoanalysis. Our sources reference summaries by Buss and Mansfield, Abra, and Oxe that detail these various models.
And a common element across many of these accounts is that moment of sudden insight, the aha experience, which often seems to occur when the person isn't consciously focused on the problem.
That's right. This phenomenon of sudden illumination is a recurring theme. However, these stage theories also highlight the importance of other steps, such as first identifying or discovering the problem, then engaging in the hard work of exploring it, and finally developing the solution and translating it into a form that can be communicated to others.
Our source material specifically highlights the model proposed by Buss and Mansfield. What makes their model particularly useful?
Their model is valuable because it builds upon earlier ideas and, importantly, it explicitly connects these stages to the personality characteristics of creative individuals, which we just discussed.
Right.
They propose 5 key processes: problem selection, extended effort, setting constraints, changing constraints, and verification and elaboration.
Let's go through each of those. Problem selection, that sounds like a really critical first step. What guides how a scientist chooses what to work on?
According to Buss and Mansfield, problem selection is mainly guided by two considerations. First, the problem needs to appear potentially solvable given the existing tools, methods, and knowledge.
Makes sense. You have to think you can actually crack it.
Exactly. There needs to be at least a reasonable chance of finding a solution. Second, the problem should be significant enough that solving it would represent a genuine creative advance in the field. They also point out that sometimes a scientist might first encounter the problem itself, perhaps as an inconsistency in a current theory, before consciously deciding to focus on finding a solution.
Okay, then comes extended effort. That just sounds like the plain hard work of doing science. Lots of late nights in the lab.
Exactly. And the duration of this effort can vary enormously, sometimes taking months or even years based on various accounts. It's often the longest part.
Then we have setting constraints and changing constraints.
Yeah.
What's the difference between those two?
Setting constraints involves the initial mental frameworks or limitations that a scientist applies to the problem. These constraints can be based on existing empirical data, current theories, or accepted methodologies. For example, in the past, the principles of classical physics acted as a theoretical constraint when scientists were grappling with the nature of light and its speed. However, sometimes these initial constraints turn out to be incorrect or unhelpful. That's where the process of changing constraints comes in. This is closely related to the idea of restructuring in Gestalt psychology, that sudden shift in how one perceives a problem.
The aha moment again.
Often, yes. It frequently involves that flash of insight where old ways of thinking are discarded and new perspectives emerge.
And the final stage is verification and elaboration.
Yes, this is where the scientist assesses the validity and value of the new insights and then develops the solution in a clear and communicable form so that it can be shared and scrutinized by the wider scientific community.
Getting it ready for publication, essentially.
Pretty much. And it's really important to remember that these 5 processes don't necessarily happen in a strict linear order. The actual sequence of events in a creative breakthrough can be much more iterative and complex, with scientists often moving back and forth between these stages.
That makes perfect sense. It's rarely a straightforward path from identifying a problem to finding its solution. Now, let's zoom out a bit and consider the creative situation, the broader context in which scientific creativity either flourishes or, is hindered. What kinds of factors does research in this area examine?
Research on the creative situation takes a very broad approach, looking at psychological, social, cultural, political, and historical factors that are thought to influence creative achievement in science.
Let's begin with the psychological and social variables. What are some key aspects there?
Torrance's 1962 list is still considered pretty relevant. He highlighted factors like the absence of significant threat, a willingness to take risks, an awareness of one's own feelings and a sense of being different, an openness to the ideas of others, confidence in one's own perceptions, and positive, mutually supportive relationships as being conducive to creative work.
Those all sound like elements that would contribute to a supportive and stimulating environment for creativity. Makes sense. What about cultural and political factors? How might they play a role?
Well, research has observed differences in the incidence of creativity across various religious groups, for instance. There have also been theories proposed about certain worldviews, such as a focus on the material world, an emphasis on individualism, a preference for abstract thinking, and a spirit of skepticism potentially being more favorable for scientific advancement.
Interesting.
And there's also been discussion, though it's important to note, our sources don't endorse any specific political viewpoints. They just report on these discussions.
Yeah, I understand.
About how political factors such as war, instability, and social unrest might be related, perhaps paradoxically sometimes, to a society's overall level of creativity.
It's definitely a complex web of interacting influences. And then there are the historical factors. This seems to delve into the question of whether certain scientific discoveries were almost inevitable at specific points in time, the whole zeitgeist idea.
Exactly. Historians of science have often argued that at certain historical junctures, particular discoveries or theoretical breakthroughs were almost destined to happen, sometimes downplaying the role of individual genius in favor of the prevailing intellectual climate, or zeitgeist, a concept prominently used by Hegel.
Right.
The Yuasa phenomenon also suggests that there are specific periods within cultures where scientific creativity seems to reach peaks in both quantity and quality, such as the era of German idealism.
And the idea of multiple discoveries, when several scientists independently arrive at the same finding around the same time, that's often cited as strong evidence for the influence of the zeitgeist, isn't it? like Newton and Leibniz with calculus.
Yes, that's the classic example. Merton argued that these multiples are a common occurrence and support the idea that discoveries are, to a large extent, a product of the broader sociocultural context. However, this view has faced challenges more recently. Lamb and Easton, as well as Simonton, have argued that the criteria used to identify multiples have often been too broad.
Too loose, maybe.
Potentially, yeah. Claiming two things discovered decades apart are really the same discovery, for example.
And Simonton even used computer simulations to investigate this, if I remember correctly. He tried to model it.
He did. His Monte Carlo simulations suggested that the observed frequency of multiple discoveries could actually be explained by purely statistical models, essentially chance, without needing to assume a strong influence of sociocultural determinism.
So maybe it's less about the spirit of the times and more about probability.
Well, while the overall intellectual climate might prepare the ground for certain ideas, Simonton's tentative conclusion is that multiples might arise from a more fundamental statistical process, basically, chance combinations of existing ideas that are then selectively recognized and developed by different people around the same time.
That's a fascinating perspective that combines the role of individual effort with broader probabilities. This leads us quite naturally to Simonton's overarching theory of scientific creativity. Chance configuration theory. Can you give us a summary of that? It sounds complex.
It is quite comprehensive. Simonton's theory proposes that the mind is constantly generating random combinations of mental elements, things like observations, existing knowledge, rules of thumb, concepts, you name it.
Okay.
Some of these random combinations happen to be stable and useful, and they get retained as what he calls configurations. These configurations can then become the building blocks for new, more complex hierarchical configurations, making our thinking processes more efficient over time. Think of it like mental Lego bricks clicking together, sometimes randomly.
So it's like the brain is constantly brainstorming, throwing ideas together, and some of those combinations just happen to stick and become useful thoughts or concepts.
That's a good way to put it. But once a configuration is formed in the mind, it doesn't automatically become a creative breakthrough that's shared with the world. It has to go through a process of selection and be structured into what Simonton terms a communication configuration so it can be effectively shared with others.
Right, you have to be able to explain it.
Exactly. And the success of this communication depends on various factors, such as whether the people receiving the information have similar background knowledge, whether their existing understanding of the topic is too rigid to accept new ideas, whether there's a shared understanding of the terms and concepts being used, and whether they can effectively translate the communicated idea back into the original mental configuration.
And Simonton argues that this theory can provide a framework for understanding a wide range of phenomena related to scientific creativity, all the stuff we've been talking about.
Exactly. He uses chance configuration theory to offer explanations for the different stages of the creative process, the correlations we see between creativity and personality traits, motivations and developmental experiences, the occurrence of multiple discoveries, how a scientist's productivity changes throughout their career, the historical patterns like the Yuasa phenomenon, and even the relationship between the sheer number of creative outputs and their overall quality. It's a very ambitious and comprehensive modern approach to understanding scientific creativity.
It sounds like a really powerful way to look at scientific breakthroughs, trying to tie it all together. Now, as we begin to wrap up our deep dive, it's always valuable to look towards the future. Based on our source material, where should future research in this extensive field be directed? What are the big unanswered questions?
Well, our sources emphasize that despite the considerable body of existing research, the psychology of scientific creativity remains a vast and evolving field with many questions still unanswered. Any list of future research directions is inevitably going to be somewhat selective, of course.
Sure.
But a couple of general recommendations stand out. First, there's a need to shift some research focus beyond just studying the psychology of scientific eminence, those rare, highly impactful breakthroughs, and to gain a deeper understanding of normal science, as Kuhn called it.
The everyday work.
Exactly. The everyday work of ordinary scientists that is absolutely crucial for the gradual advancement of knowledge. Second, researchers should leverage the implicit understandings that scientists themselves have about scientific creativity, their own intuitions and experiences to help develop more robust and useful explicit theories in the field.
So ask the scientists themselves more.
Basically, yes. This includes investigating not just what scientific creativity is, but also how it can be identified, nurtured, taught, mentored, and encouraged in practical ways.
And within the traditional categories of product, person, process, and situation, what are some specific areas that warrant further investigation?
McKinnon, in particular, emphasized the ongoing need for a more robust system for evaluating scientific work, especially considering the increasing prevalence of collaborative research teamwork.
Right, science is often done in big teams now.
Precisely. While publication and citation analysis have been valuable tools, we need more nuanced methods to assess the contributions of both research teams and individual scientists within those teams, moving beyond simply counting citations. Studies that connect citation analysis with other measures of quality, like those expert rating scales we discussed earlier, are also needed.
Okay, so better evaluation of products, especially team products. What about the person?
Regarding the creative person, there's a pressing need for improved psychological tools, better tests or assessments to identify scientific talent and to predict potential for success at different stages of education and training. This would involve developing diagnostic models that consider a broader range of abilities, skills, and personality characteristics across a scientist's development.
And the process.
For the creative process, there's a strong call for more studies that observe scientists in real-world settings concurrently with their work, rather than relying solely on recollections of past successful problem solving. We need to see it as it happens.
Get inside the lab, so to speak.
Exactly. While the aha moment remains intriguing, more research is needed on the often lengthy period of extended effort, focusing on the cognitive and motivational factors involved to potentially enhance scientists' efficiency during that grind.
And finally, the situation.
Concerning the creative situation, more research is essential on the dynamics of scientists working in groups, given that increasing trend towards teamwork. Current approaches to creativity training often don't adequately address group work and the different roles individuals play within research teams. How do teams spark creativity differently than individuals?
Those are all really important areas for future exploration. And our source material concludes with a broader call for a more global perspective on this research, right? Not just looking at Western science.
Yes, a final recommendation is to recognize that much of our current understanding of scientific creativity is based on research conducted primarily in Western cultures, particularly in English-speaking countries. Limited evidence from other cultures suggests that perspectives on creativity might differ. Therefore, adopting a more international approach to researching scientific creativity is vital for gaining a more comprehensive and universal understanding.
This has truly been a deep dive into the fascinating world of scientific creativity, examining everything from the tangible products to the individuals who create them, the processes they undertake, and the contexts that shape their work. Hopefully, this overview has provided you, our listener, with a valuable shortcut to understanding the key insights in this field, sparking some aha moments without leaving you feeling overwhelmed.
Absolutely. It's a complex and multifaceted topic with a rich history of investigation and clearly exciting directions for future discovery.
And on that note, here's a final thought for you to consider. With the increasing prevalence of large interdisciplinary research teams, how might our traditional ways of measuring scientific creativity and individual contributions need to adapt? It's worth thinking about the dynamics within these collaborative environments and how creativity actually manifests, maybe even differently, in those contexts. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. We'll catch you next time.